There are truths that sit inside the human heart like burning coals, hidden beneath layers of silence, but always glowing, always waiting to scorch if touched. I have carried such a truth for most of my life, holding it so tightly that I thought it would crush me from within. I have prayed over it, tried to bury it beneath rosaries and hymns, but it refused to die. And now, after years of vows and silence, I feel compelled to speak, not for pity, not for scandal, but because secrets rot the soul, and I want mine to be clean before God. I was not always a woman of the cloth. Once, I was a girl like any other, hopeful, curious, and full of dreams too fragile to survive what would come. My childhood home was small and ordinary, set along a quiet American street where neighbors waved across fences and church bells marked the hours. To outsiders, we looked like any respectable family. Inside, the air carried another story, one that no visitor would have ever guessed. My father was a figure both commanding and ordinary, a man who worked with his hands, spoke with authority, and rarely smiled. In the eyes of the world, he was a provider. In the eyes of the church, he was a pew filler, bowing his head during prayers on Sunday mornings. But in the eyes of a young girl, my eyes, he became something far more terrible. I remember being small enough to still cling to childish things, yet old enough to sense that the warmth of home was slowly being replaced by shadows. My mother lived in a rhythm of weariness, busy with chores and quick to silence questions she did not want to answer. And my father, well, his footsteps grew heavier each night, his presence thicker, until the house itself seemed to shrink around him. It was during those nights that I began to understand fear in a way no child should. The door to my room would open when the house had gone quiet, and I would lie very still, pretending to sleep, hoping that stillness would make me invisible. But the darkness was not fooled, and I learned that hope does not always stop the weight of a man determined to break what he should protect. I will not describe the details. Some things are better left in the silence where they belong. But I will say this: the man who gave me life took from me the very innocence that made it worth living. At first, I thought it might happen only once, that perhaps it had been a nightmare, a mistake, a fever dream brought on by childish imagination. But it happened again and again, until I understood that this was my new life, carved in secrecy, sealed with terror. Each dawn I woke feeling older than my years, though I was barely a teenager. Each dusk filled me with dread, knowing the night would bring footsteps down the hallway, the creak of a door, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. In those early days, I did not have words for what was happening. All I had was confusion. How could the same man who told me to bow my head at the supper table become the monster who hovered over me in the dark? I tried once to hint to my mother, to tell her that the nights frightened me, that the walls in my room seemed to close in when he was near. She hushed me with a tired smile, brushing hair from my face, whispering, "Don't be silly, child. Your father loves you." That word, love, became twisted in my mind, no longer a gift, but a curse. Silence became my only refuge. If I did not speak it, perhaps it was not real. If I folded my hands and closed my lips, perhaps God would see the truth anyway and deliver me. I prayed more fervently than any child I knew, whispered psalms into my pillow, begged for angels to stand at my door. Yet the angels never came. Or perhaps they did, but only to give me the strength to survive another night. My name, though I have not spoken it here until now, is Frances Delaney. And though many know me now as Sister Frances, a woman cloaked in habit and faith, I was once just a trembling girl trying to carry a secret too heavy for her shoulders. If I tell you this, it is not to relive the cruelty, but to testify to the endurance of the soul. I broke, oh yes, I broke, but I also healed in ways I never thought possible. But healing did not come quickly. First came the slow unraveling of who I was. My laughter grew faint. My appetite vanished. Teachers at school noticed my slipping grades, my absent stare, the way my hands shook when called upon. I wore oversized sweaters in summer heat, as though cloth could shield me from the shame I carried. My friends drifted away, confused by the distance I placed between us, and I let them go, thinking I was too stained for companionship. My faith, fragile yet persistent, was the only thing I clung to. I remember kneeling in the small parish church near our home, the candles flickering in the draught, whispering not just prayers, but bargains. Lord, if you save me tonight, I will never complain again. If you make him stop, I will serve you forever. They were the bargains of a desperate child, but they planted seeds I would not understand until much later. Night after night, my world narrowed to survival. By day, I wore the mask of a dutiful daughter, a polite student, a quiet neighbor. By night, I became a prisoner in my own home. It is a strange thing to live with a wound that no one else can see. People look at you and think you are whole. They smile at you in the street, not realizing you are breaking with each step. It continued until one evening. I will never forget it. I felt something inside me snap. Not just fear, not just sorrow, but a fracture so deep that I knew I could not endure much longer. My body trembled, my spirit hollowed, and even the prayers on my lips felt empty. I had carried the weight too long. That night, as the door creaked and footsteps approached once more, I whispered a different kind of prayer. Not for deliverance, but for an end. Any end. And that, dear listener, was the moment I truly broke. Before the shadows came, there was light. I do not want you to think my life was born only of pain. No. I had a childhood like many others, filled with the little details that seem ordinary at the time, but glow with tenderness when remembered later. There were summer evenings when fireflies blinked across the grass like scattered stars. There were Sunday mornings when the air smelled of fresh bread and hymn books, and the pews at church filled with voices that rose toward heaven. There were times I believed, with the unshaken trust of a child, that the world was good and that home was safe. My earliest memories are of my mother humming at the stove, her back turned as she stirred soup that bubbled in a dented pot. The kitchen walls were lined with fading wallpaper, but to me it was the heart of the world. She wore her tiredness like an apron, always tied and ready, yet her hands were gentle when she brushed the hair from my forehead or guided me to bed with a kiss. She was not a woman of many words, but when she did speak softly to me, her voice had the power to still my restless spirit. I remember afternoons when the neighborhood children would gather in the dusty lot across the street. We would draw chalk lines for games, chase one another until our shoes wore thin, and laugh with the kind of abandon only children can know. I was quiet among them, often lingering at the edges rather than in the center of play. Still, I felt a part of something, part of a community that seemed steady and sure. School in those early years was a place of both comfort and challenge. I loved the crisp sound of pages turning, the smell of pencils freshly sharpened, the neat rows of desks that made the world feel orderly. Teachers often praised my handwriting, my careful reading, my ability to memorize hymns. And yet, even then, there was a loneliness tucked deep within me, though I did not yet know its name. Perhaps I sensed already that the security I clung to was more fragile than it appeared. My father, before the darkness revealed itself, was a figure larger than life in my eyes. He was stern but respected, the man who carried heavy burdens without complaint. I recall watching from the porch as he returned from long days of labor, his shirt damp with sweat, his boots coated with dust. He smelled of earth and iron, of a world beyond my understanding. And when he lifted me into his arms, those rare times he softened, my small body felt both safe and weightless. In those fleeting moments, I believed he was the strongest man alive, my shield against whatever the world might bring. Looking back, I see the irony. How cruel that the very arms that once lifted me high would later become the source of my deepest fear. But at that time, as a child still wrapped in innocence, I could not have imagined it. The years seemed to drift forward gently. Each season carried its rituals, pumpkins carved in autumn, carols sung in winter, the smell of lilacs in spring. I carried my little secrets too, the kind only children treasure. A favorite doll hidden under the bed, a journal filled with scribbles, a small stone I believed lucky. There was still joy, still hope. Faith was woven into those days like thread through cloth. Our parish church stood only a few blocks away, its bell tower visible even from our front steps. I would walk there with my mother, my small hand tucked in hers, listening to the clatter of our shoes on the cobblestones. Inside, the stained glass windows cast colors on the floor, like jewels spilled from heaven. I was mesmerized, certain God himself painted the light just for me. I prayed then, with a child's simplicity, asking for good grades, for sunny weather, for my mother's smiles. I never prayed for safety, because safety was something I assumed I already had. That assumption would one day be shattered. But if I close my eyes even now, I can still return to those earliest years when trust was unbroken and laughter came easily. I see myself sitting at the wooden table in our kitchen, feet dangling above the floor, nibbling bread, while my father spoke in a low rumble and my mother nodded absently. I hear the crickets outside the window, the clink of cutlery, the rhythm of life unremarkable in its routine. Ordinary moments that felt eternal. I share these memories not because they lasted, but because they matter. They remind me that I was once whole, once unscarred. They remind me that the girl I used to be still lives inside the woman I became. That girl deserved safety. She deserved to grow into her dreams without fear. When I remember her, I feel both sorrow and tenderness, as though I am holding a fragile photograph that time tried to burn, but could not completely destroy. It is painful to recall how quickly that innocence was undone. It began with small things, a glance from my father that lingered too long, a tone in his voice that made my skin prickle though I did not know why. I shrugged it off as imagination, the mind of a child inventing monsters in the shadows. But these were not shadows of the imagination. They were foreshadowing. One evening, I noticed the change most clearly. We had just returned from church, and my mother busied herself in the kitchen. I sat on the porch, swinging my legs and humming the hymn we had sung only an hour earlier. My father stepped out behind me, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He placed his hand on my shoulder, heavy and lingering. There was nothing in the gesture that anyone else would have thought strange, but something deep inside me recoiled. That was the first flicker, the first warning. I did not yet understand its meaning, but my soul did. Children have instincts they cannot name, and mine told me to be afraid. Still, I clung to innocence as long as I could. I wanted to believe in the man who had once carried me in his arms. I wanted to believe in the God who painted light across church floors. I wanted to believe that childhood was unbreakable. But belief is fragile, and mine was already cracking. I did not know it then, but the nights ahead would change me forever. The safe world of fireflies and hymns was about to collapse, leaving me to walk a path no child should ever walk. The first time it happened, the world around me seemed to split in two. There was the world of ordinary hours, daylight, voices at school, the rhythm of prayers in the chapel. And then there was the other world, the world behind closed doors, where silence became a prison, and footsteps down the hall sounded like the tolling of doom. I remember it too clearly, though I have spent years trying to forget. It was an evening like any other, with supper finished and the dishes stacked neatly by my mother's hands. She retired early, worn down from chores, and I retreated to my room with a book, trying to hold on to the comfort of printed words. The air was heavy with summer heat, the kind that clings to the walls and refuses to lift. My window was open, but even the night breeze felt stifled. It began with the creak of the hallway floorboards, a sound I had heard countless times without fear. But this time was different. My body stiffened before my mind understood why. The door opened, slow and deliberate, and the figure that filled the frame was one I knew too well. My father's face was unreadable, his shadow stretching across the floor until it reached the edge of my bed. I wanted to believe he had come to check on me, to tuck the blanket higher, to offer some small sign of care. That is what fathers are meant to do. But there was something in his eyes that silenced every hopeful thought, something that made my breath catch in my throat. He closed the door behind him, and the sound of the latch falling into place echoed like the click of a lock in a cell. I will not describe what followed in detail. Some wounds are better left behind veils of silence, not because they lack severity, but because their weight can be carried without dragging their images into the open. What I can tell you is how it felt. As though the ground beneath me gave way, as though every prayer I had whispered was swallowed by darkness. I learned in that hour what it meant to be powerless in your own home. When it was over, I curled into myself, trembling so fiercely I thought my bones might splinter. My father left as quietly as he had come, closing the door behind him as though nothing had occurred. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my body rigid, my mind refusing to process the enormity of what had taken place. The next morning, I moved through the house like a ghost. My mother asked if I felt ill, noting the pallor of my skin, but I shook my head quickly. I had no words, no language to explain the truth. How does a child say aloud that her protector has become her violator? Even the thought turned my stomach with shame I did not deserve, but already carried. In the days that followed, I convinced myself it had been a single terrible mistake. Perhaps exhaustion had twisted his mind, perhaps it would never happen again. I clung to denial the way a drowning soul clings to driftwood. But denial is fragile, and one night later that week, the footsteps returned. The door creaked. The weight pressed down again. And I understood with sickening clarity, this was not a mistake. This was the new order of my life. Fear took root in me like a vine, spreading through every corner of my thoughts. I became watchful, counting the hours until nightfall with dread, listening for the smallest sound that might signal his approach. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion always overcame me, and in that half-dreaming state, the terror always returned. I began to avoid my father in the daylight. I would slip out of rooms when he entered, keep my eyes fixed on the floor, retreat into silence whenever he spoke. My mother noticed, of course. "Why are you so distant, child?" she asked one afternoon, pressing folded laundry into my arms. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. The truth lodged in my throat like a stone. Instead, I muttered something about schoolwork and fled. At school, I changed as well. The once diligent student became distracted, her notebooks filled with shaky handwriting and unfinished lessons. My teachers asked if something was wrong at home, but I only forced a smile, insisting I was simply tired. Children know how to lie when survival depends on it. I sought refuge in prayer. Each night, after the door finally closed and silence returned, I would kneel on the floor, whispering to the crucifix above my bed. "Lord, make it stop. Send your angels. Do not let me be alone." But heaven remained silent. Or perhaps heaven was present only in the strength that allowed me to endure another night. Even so, I began to wonder if God saw me at all. As the nights stretched into weeks, something inside me began to fracture. I still smiled faintly when neighbors greeted us. I still sang the hymns my mother loved. But beneath that surface, I was unraveling. The laughter of other children sounded foreign, their carefree play almost cruel in its contrast to my hidden torment. I felt myself drifting further from the world, as though I lived behind glass, unseen and unheard. The betrayal cut deepest, not in the act itself, but in the shattering of trust. Fathers are meant to be guardians, walls against harm. Mine had become the harm, and once that bond is broken, nothing feels safe again. One night stands out more than the others. I had taken to locking my bedroom door, hoping the thin barrier might protect me. But a lock is only metal, and metal bends to will. He pushed it open with ease, the sound splintering what little security I had left. As he stepped inside, I realized there was no corner of the world where I could truly hide. That night, I stopped believing in safety altogether. I cannot tell you how many times it happened. The mind blurs repetition when pain is constant. But I can tell you that after each night, I grew smaller inside, more hollow, more silent. My childhood was slipping through my fingers like sand, and I could do nothing to hold on to it. Still, a part of me refused to surrender entirely. Somewhere deep, a voice whispered that I was more than what was being done to me. That small voice, fragile though it was, kept me breathing. It reminded me that the story was not finished, even when I felt I had already reached the end. But the silence came at a cost. With every day that I pretended nothing was wrong, with every lie of omission, the weight on my chest grew heavier. I knew, though I tried not to admit it, that I could not carry this burden forever. Something would have to break, either me or the silence itself. And so the question became not if, but when. There comes a point when silence no longer feels like a choice, but a sentence. I had begun to wear it like a second skin, as if my very breath would betray me if I let it speak too freely. The nights repeated themselves with dreadful certainty, like the toll of a clock you cannot stop, and my words shrank until I barely used them at all. In the daylight, I moved as though everything was normal, while in truth, nothing was. Each morning I folded my sheets as neatly as I could, hiding any trace of the night. I would brush my hair, wash my face, and stand before the mirror, telling myself that no one could see the truth unless I let it slip from my lips. But my eyes betrayed me. They had grown older, dimmer, as though some light had been stolen and would never return. When teachers at school looked at me, they often tilted their heads, puzzled, as if they recognized something slipping but could not name it. Friends began to drift further away. They did not understand why I avoided sleepovers, why I refused invitations to birthday parties, why laughter seemed to sit uneasily on my face. They teased at first, thinking I had grown shy or proud, but eventually they stopped asking, and I was left on the margins, alone with a silence too loud to escape. I told myself that keeping the secret was protecting my mother. She was already weary, her shoulders bent beneath the weight of household burdens. If I spoke, I feared it would break her spirit entirely. I feared she would look at me and see not her daughter, but a girl stained with something unspeakable. I feared that if I cried out, I would lose what little family I had left, and so I stayed quiet, convincing myself that silence was a kind of love. Yet silence is not love. It is poison, and it seeps slowly until it touches everything. I noticed it in my prayers first. Words that once came easily now stumbled from my tongue. Kneeling in the chapel or by my bedside, I whispered pleas to God, but they felt hollow, as if they rose no higher than the ceiling above me. I asked why He remained silent too, why the angels I begged for never came. But perhaps they were there, not to deliver me, but to give me the strength to endure. Still, as a child, endurance felt like abandonment. Nights blurred into one another. I would count the cracks in the ceiling, trace the pattern of wallpaper in my mind, anything to distract from the dread. But dread always won, and each time the door creaked, I froze, my body surrendering before my mind could even resist. That was the cruelest part, not just what was done, but how it trained me to stillness, how it taught me that resistance was useless. The silence consumed not just my voice, but my very sense of self. At school, my grades slipped further. My mind wandered during lessons, drifting far away even as chalk scraped across the blackboard. When called upon, I answered with a stammer, cheeks burning, heart pounding, though the question was simple. I feared attention of any kind, afraid that if anyone looked too closely, they might see the truth etched across my skin. The cycle began to take a toll on my body. I grew thin, my appetite gone. Sleep never refreshed me. Instead, I woke more exhausted than when I had laid down. Dark circles formed beneath my eyes, and my hands trembled when I held a pencil. My mother began to notice. "You must eat more," she scolded gently, pushing food toward me. But I could not. Food felt heavy in my stomach, as though I were swallowing stones. I tried once, just once, to break the silence. I remember sitting on the porch steps one twilight, the sky streaked with shades of violet and gold. My mother sat beside me, folding laundry on her lap. I opened my mouth, heart pounding, desperate to let the words out. "Mama," I whispered, "I'm scared at night." She glanced at me briefly, her face etched with fatigue. "Every child has nightmares," she said, smoothing a shirt across her knee. And just like that, the door to confession slammed shut. I knew then that I was truly alone. And so, the silence grew thicker. It spread into my very identity. I became a girl of shadows, moving carefully, speaking little, avoiding attention. Inside, I screamed endlessly, but no sound left my lips. It was as though my life had split in two. The visible girl who played the role of daughter and student, and the hidden girl who bore the secret shame of the nights. I sometimes wonder which was heavier, the abuse itself or the silence that followed it. Silence convinces you that you deserve what happens, that if you were stronger or braver, you would have spoken, and that your failure to do so means you are complicit. These are lies, but lies repeated long enough begin to feel like truth. I carried those lies deep in my chest, believing they were mine to hold forever. One winter evening stands clear in my mind. The house was cold, the wind rattling against the windows, and I lay curled beneath a quilt. I heard his footsteps again, steady, certain, as though he had every right to claim the night. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer simply afraid. I was numb. Fear had been replaced by a strange emptiness, a hollow where my heart should have been racing. That emptiness frightened me even more, because I realized I was losing pieces of myself, piece by piece, night by night. By the time I reached my teenage years, silence had devoured almost everything. My voice was gone, my joy diminished, my trust shattered. I existed more than I lived, floating through each day, waiting only for nightfall to confirm what I already knew, that I was trapped in a cycle that seemed endless. And yet, cycles do not last forever. Something always gives way, whether it is the body, the mind, or the fragile wall of silence that holds it all together. I did not know it then, but the silence I thought would protect me was already preparing to break. And when it broke, it would do so violently, in a way that would change everything. Silence, as I had learned, can feel endless. But even silence has a breaking point. Mine came slowly, like a crack forming in glass, spreading day by day until one night the entire pane shattered. I had grown thin as a shadow. My clothes hung loose on my frame, my skin pale from sleeplessness. At school, my teachers whispered in the hallway when they thought I could not hear. "She looks unwell," one said. "Something is wrong at home," another murmured. But when asked directly, I forced a smile, insisting I was fine. Lies came easier than truth. They protected me, or so I thought. Inside, though, I was unraveling. My body trembled with exhaustion. My stomach rejected food, and headaches struck like sudden storms. Even my faith began to falter. I still whispered prayers at night, but they came out dry, as if my lips had forgotten how to form hope. It was not that I stopped believing in God. It was that I could not see Him through the fog of despair. There were moments when I felt my mind slipping, as though I stood outside myself, watching a girl I no longer recognized. In the classroom, I heard the teacher's voice but could not follow the words. On the street, I walked past neighbors but could not recall their greetings. Life blurred at the edges. The silence had consumed so much that even my grip on reality began to weaken. One evening stands etched in memory. Winter had deepened, the air brittle with frost. I had locked myself in the bathroom, staring into the cracked mirror above the sink. My face looked foreign, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, lips pressed thin. I whispered, "Who are you?" The reflection gave no answer. I leaned closer, as though some secret might be revealed if I searched hard enough. But all I saw was a girl fading into nothing. That night, when the footsteps came again, something inside me broke in a way I had not felt before. I lay stiff, eyes wide open, and in the dark I made a decision I did not fully understand. I no longer cared if I lived to see morning. The will to fight, even the will to hope, had drained away. I had become a vessel emptied of everything except despair. Afterward, I remember walking to school the next day as though my body moved without me. My legs carried me, but my spirit lagged far behind. Halfway through the morning, a teacher stopped me in the hallway. "Child, are you all right?" she asked, placing a hand on my shoulder. The question was kind, but it broke me. Tears welled up so suddenly that I could not stop them. I muttered something about being tired and fled to the restroom, locking myself in a stall where I sobbed until the bell rang. That was the first outward crack. Others followed. I fainted one afternoon while carrying books to class. My head spun, my knees buckled, and when I woke on the infirmary cot, the nurse looked down at me with worry. "You are malnourished," she said gently. "Has something happened at home?" Again, I shook my head, sealing the silence with lies. But bodies tell truths that lips refuse to. My frame weakened further. My eyes carried shadows that no sleep could erase. I began missing days of school altogether, too sick or too fearful to leave my bed. My mother grew more anxious, hovering at the door of my room with bowls of broth and questions she did not truly want answered. I saw it in her eyes: suspicion, confusion, dread. She looked at me as though she sensed a storm, but could not admit it existed. The collapse came fully one spring evening. I was in my room when a wave of dizziness struck. The walls tilted, the floor rose, and suddenly I was on the ground, gasping for air. My mother found me there minutes later, limp and unresponsive. I awoke to the blur of her frantic voice, the feel of cool hands against my fevered skin. That night, I was carried to the local doctor. His office smelled of antiseptic and paper, the walls lined with jars and instruments that made me tremble. He examined me quietly, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing moment. He asked questions I could not answer, questions that pricked too close to the truth. My mother stood nearby, wringing her hands, avoiding my eyes. "You are malnourished, overstressed," the doctor said finally, though his gaze lingered as if he suspected more. He advised rest, nourishment, observation, but in his tone there was an unspoken question, something he could not yet name aloud. In the days that followed, I was confined to my bed. My mother brought trays of food I could barely eat, insisting I regain my strength. My father grew restless, his glances sharper, his footsteps heavier. He knew, I think, that the facade was crumbling. He knew that my collapse threatened his secret. I remember lying awake one night, my body weak, my mind drifting. I realized I had reached a point beyond silence. My body was no longer able to keep the secret hidden. The truth was beginning to leak through the cracks, through fainting spells, through tears, through the hollow look in my eyes. I could not hold it in much longer. That awareness terrified me and, strangely, gave me hope. Because collapse, as dreadful as it felt, meant change was near. Collapse meant the silence would no longer hold. Collapse meant the secret was on the verge of being forced into the light. I clutched my blanket that night, whispering words that felt like both surrender and plea. Lord, let it end. One way or another, let it end, and soon it would. Secrets rarely stay hidden forever. For a long time I believed mine would, that I would carry it silently to the grave. But the body betrays what the mouth refuses to say, and my collapse had already set the stage for truth to rise. What followed was not a confession by choice, but a revelation torn from the shadows against my will. The days after my fainting spell blurred together. My mother hovered constantly, placing trays of food by my bedside, urging me to eat, watching with eyes that no longer looked away so quickly. She was beginning to see what she did not want to admit. Each time she caught me trembling or gasping in my sleep, I saw the fear deepen in her face. She would wring her hands, open her mouth to ask a question, then close it again, as if silencing herself was easier than hearing the truth. But silence could not last. One evening, the fever returned. My skin burned, sweat dampening my hair, and my body shook so violently that my mother rushed me again to the doctor. He examined me carefully, listening not only to my heartbeat, but to the tremor in my voice when I answered his questions. He leaned close, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. "Child," he said gently, "is there something happening to you that you cannot speak of?" The words lodged in my throat. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything, to beg for someone to see me at last. But fear clamped down. My father's threats echoed in my ears, his warning that if I ever told, no one would believe me, that I would destroy our family, that I would be the cause of shame too heavy to bear. So I said nothing. My silence hung in the room like a weight, and the doctor studied me with eyes that seemed to know more than I admitted. When he left to speak privately with my mother, I overheard fragments through the thin wall. "She is not only ill," he said quietly. "There is something deeper, something wrong." My mother's voice trembled in reply. "What are you saying?" And then, silence, as if words failed them both. That night, my mother sat on the edge of my bed. The lamplight cast shadows across her face, making her look older, more fragile. She smoothed the blanket over me with trembling hands. "You can tell me anything," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word. Anything. I opened my mouth, but the truth felt like fire. I shook my head, burying my face in the pillow. She began to weep quietly, and the sound pierced me deeper than any wound. She knew, though I had not spoken. Perhaps a mother always knows, even when she tries to deny it. The revelation did not come through my lips. It came through my body, through my collapse, through the undeniable evidence of a child breaking under a weight too heavy. My father grew restless in those days, pacing the house with fury simmering just beneath the surface. He avoided my mother's eyes, barked orders with a sharper edge, slammed doors more violently. He sensed that the silence was unraveling, and for the first time, I saw fear in him too. One night, I woke to the sound of shouting. My mother's voice, sharp with accusation, cut through the walls. My father's deeper roar answered back, filled with rage and denial. I crept to the top of the staircase, heart pounding, and listened. "I know," my mother cried. "I know what you've done." "Lies," he spat. "She's sick in the head making things up. She's wasting away before my eyes." She screamed. "Do you think I cannot see? Do you think I am blind?" There was a crash, perhaps a chair overturned, and then silence so thick I thought the house itself held its breath. I slipped back to my room, shaking, terrified not only of my father, but of what might follow now that the truth had been spoken aloud. The days after that confrontation were a blur of chaos. My mother no longer left me alone in his presence. She kept me near her side, her eyes fierce with a protectiveness I had longed for but feared would never come. She wrote letters, whispered hurried conversations with neighbors, made visits to the parish priest. I sensed the circle widening, the secret spilling beyond our home. It was not a clean revelation, not a single moment of confession. It was messy, fractured, filled with denial and half-spoken words. But once spoken, even in fragments, the truth could not be contained again. My father grew angrier, his denial louder, but I could see cracks forming in his mask. For the first time, the weight was not mine alone to carry. And yet, revelation is never simple. With truth comes consequence. The family I had known was collapsing. The walls of the house that once seemed unshakable now felt like they might crumble entirely. And I, the silent child, stood at the center of the storm, finally seen, finally exposed, but terrified of what exposure would cost. I lay awake many nights then, clutching the blanket, wondering if I had done the right thing by breaking, wondering if survival was worth the destruction it brought. Because when secrets are forced into the light, they scorch everything around them. Still, even in the chaos, I felt a strange sense of relief. The silence had finally cracked. The burden I had carried alone was now visible to others, and though fear still gripped me, though shame still whispered in my ear, a small part of me felt the faint stirrings of freedom. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. When the truth escapes its prison, it does not simply free the captive, it shakes the foundations of every wall that tried to contain it. That was the storm we lived through after the revelation. My family, once bound together by appearance and routine, began to fracture into pieces too sharp to ever fit back together again. My mother changed first. She hovered constantly, never letting me out of her sight, as if her presence could shield me from everything that had already happened. Her eyes no longer carried only exhaustion. They carried fire. Sometimes she would look at me with tears, sometimes with guilt, as though she blamed herself for not seeing sooner. Other times she looked at me with such fierce love that I could hardly bear it, because I had longed for that protection when it mattered most. But alongside her protection came her silence. Though she confronted my father in anger, in the days that followed, she grew quieter, as though she did not know what to do next. Fear pressed down on her too, the fear of shame, of neighbors' whispers, of a life torn apart if the truth spread too far. She oscillated between defender and denier, and I, the child at the center, felt torn with her. My father grew darker in those days. His voice, once commanding but calm, turned harsh, brittle, and laced with rage. He avoided me when others were near, but glared at me when no one was watching, a silent threat that chilled me more than any words could. He insisted to my mother, to anyone who would listen, that I was making it up, that I was weak, hysterical, troubled. Denial became his shield, and he wielded it with fury. Neighbors began to notice the tension in our house. They would glance at us on the street, their eyes lingering too long, their whispers following after we passed. I heard fragments. Something is wrong in that family. She looks so pale. The father's temper has worsened. People sense truth even when it is hidden. And whispers, like sparks, can ignite fires. The parish priest visited once, at my mother's request. I remember sitting stiffly in the living room, the Bible open on the table, his voice low as he prayed for peace within this household. He looked at me gently, with compassion, but asked no direct questions. Perhaps he suspected, perhaps he feared naming it. Adults often believe silence protects the innocent. I had already learned silence is what destroys us. The aftermath unfolded not only in the house but within me. I no longer lived in the numbness of silence. I now lived in the raw exposure of truth. It felt both freeing and terrifying. Every glance from my mother, every whisper from neighbors, every denial from my father reminded me that the secret was no longer mine alone. And yet the shame still clung to me, whispering that I had broken the family, that I had caused the storm. Children often believe they are the source of their suffering, even when they are only its victims. The tension in the house reached a boiling point one night. My father shouted at my mother, his voice shaking the walls. She shouted back, her hands clenched at her sides. I stood in the hallway, trembling as their words cut through the air. "You've destroyed us," he roared. "You destroyed us yourself," she spat back. Their voices clashed until my mother suddenly fell silent. She looked toward me, her eyes softening, and for the first time, she stepped between us. Not just with words, but with action. "You will not touch her again," she said, her voice firm, final. It was the moment she chose me over him, and though it did not erase the past, it changed the present. From that day, he kept his distance. He sulked, he shouted, he slammed doors, but he no longer entered my room at night. Fear still lingered, but the pattern had been broken. I slept uneasily, waiting for footsteps that no longer came, startled awake by the silence itself. Relief did not come quickly. It was laced with suspicion, as if danger might return at any moment. But danger was not the only shadow that lingered. The community around us grew more curious, more suspicious. Some neighbors looked at us with pity, others with judgment. My mother avoided their eyes, pulling me close whenever we walked to church. I felt exposed, as though every gaze could see the truth stamped across my skin. In school, teachers treated me gently, as if I were fragile glass. Their kindness was both comforting and unbearable. I wanted to be invisible, to slip through their eyes unnoticed. Yet their concern reminded me daily of what had been revealed. The aftermath was not just about survival. It was about learning how broken trust reshapes a life. I no longer believed in safety. I no longer believed that homes were sanctuaries or that families were unshakable. I lived in a limbo of fear and tentative relief, unsure of what the future held. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted. The revelation, painful as it was, had given me a glimpse of something I had not known before: the possibility of rescue. My mother's stand, the priest's prayers, the doctor's questions, all of them whispered the same truth. I was not invisible. Others saw, even if imperfectly. And if others saw, then perhaps deliverance was possible. Still, deliverance had not come yet. The air in the house remained heavy, my father's presence like a storm cloud that threatened even when it did not rain. My mother guarded me fiercely, but I could feel the cost of her vigilance wearing her down. The world outside offered no clear refuge, only whispers and stares. I remember lying awake one night, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the home I had once known was gone. Whether or not the walls still stood, the family inside had crumbled. I no longer belonged to the safety of childhood. I belonged to the aftermath of truth, and in that aftermath, the question grew louder each day. Where could I go now? After the storm inside our house, nothing felt familiar. The walls stood in the same place, the furniture stayed where it always had, but the home itself no longer existed. It was only a shelter of wood and brick, haunted by what had been spoken and what could no longer be unsaid. My father moved through it like a caged animal, pacing, muttering, retreating into long silences of his own. My mother hovered near me, guarding, yet never fully naming what had happened. We were three people bound by a fractured truth, each carrying it differently, one in denial, one in guilt, and one in wounds. I knew I could not stay there forever. Though the nights of footsteps had ceased, fear lived in every corner. Even the sound of the floorboards creaking made my stomach twist. I longed for air, for space, for a place where the weight of dread did not press against my chest every moment. Refuge came not in a sudden rescue, but in small steps, through people who saw more than I could say. A teacher at school noticed my continued weakness, my absent gaze, my shrinking presence in the classroom. She spoke gently to me one afternoon, her eyes filled with the kind of care that does not demand but invites. "You're carrying something too heavy," she said softly. I shook my head, unable to reply, but the kindness in her tone stayed with me long after I left her desk. It was through her concern that a social worker was contacted. I remember sitting in a small office with pale yellow walls, the air smelling faintly of old books and coffee. A woman sat across from me, her notepad resting on her knee. She did not push or pry. Instead, she asked questions with patience, wading through the silence that often followed. Though I could not bring myself to speak the full truth, she seemed to hear it anyway. Sometimes understanding does not need words, it only needs presence. Soon, arrangements were made for me to spend time away from home. My mother agreed, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps with relief. I was sent to stay for a season with distant relatives, and later with a parish convent that welcomed me for retreats. Each move felt strange, like stepping into a world where the air was lighter, yet where I was a stranger. And yet, in those unfamiliar spaces, I tasted something new, the possibility of safety. At the convent, I encountered women whose lives were marked not by secrets but by vows. They carried themselves with a quiet strength, their days ordered by prayer and service. At first, I felt out of place among them, a broken child in the presence of women who seemed whole. But they did not treat me as fragile glass. They welcomed me into their rhythms, sweeping floors, tending gardens, folding laundry, singing hymns at dawn. It was in the chapel that I felt the first stirrings of refuge. The air smelled of candle wax and incense, the wooden pews polished by years of hands resting upon them. Light filtered through stained glass, painting the floor in colors I remembered from my earliest childhood visits to church. As I knelt there, I whispered prayers not only of desperation, but of gratitude, that for the first time in years I could kneel without fear of footsteps behind me. I was not yet healed. Nightmares still visited me, jolting me awake in the dark. Trust did not return quickly. Every kind gesture carried the shadow of suspicion. But in those days, surrounded by women who lived with discipline and devotion, I felt the faintest sense of rebuilding. They never asked for details. They did not demand my story. They simply offered space, and in that space, my soul began to breathe again. One of the sisters took a special interest in me. She noticed how I lingered after prayers, how I carried questions in my eyes even when my mouth stayed shut. "You don't have to speak everything aloud," she told me one morning as we tended the garden together. "Sometimes God hears the silence better than he hears the words." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes, grateful for wisdom that did not press me further than I was ready to go. The social worker checked on me often, her visits steady and consistent. She asked about my health, my schoolwork, my feelings. Sometimes I answered, sometimes I shrugged. But I began to realize that having people ask, even when I could not respond, mattered. It meant I was not invisible anymore. Still, refuge was not permanent. I returned home at times, and the tension there was unbearable. My father grew colder, angrier, his denial hardened into a wall he would never let fall. My mother grew more protective, but also more distant, as though she carried her own silent war inside her. The house no longer felt like a place I could belong. Each time I returned from the convent, I longed to go back, to live in the peace of prayer and song rather than the chaos of broken family bonds. Was during those alternating seasons, between the shattered home and the refuge of the convent, that I began to see a path forming, though I did not yet name it. A path where faith was not just a prayer whispered in desperation, but a way of life. A path where silence was no longer a prison, but a vow chosen freely. For now, though, refuge was enough. Safety, even in fragments, was enough. To wake without fear, to work with my hands, to feel the warmth of candlelight on my face as voices rose in hymn. That was enough to remind me that life could still hold beauty, even after so much had been taken, and yet, Deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. Refuge is not the same as healing. Safety is not the same as peace. My journey was far from over. The scars still ached, the memories still bled, and my trust in the world was still fragile as glass. But I had glimpsed something beyond survival. I had glimpsed the possibility of a calling. Refuge had shown me that survival was possible, but it did not yet tell me who I was meant to become. For years, I lived in the shadow of what had been done to me, believing my identity was shaped only by pain. But in the quiet halls of the convent, something shifted. I began to see that suffering does not only break, it also carves. And in those carved spaces, something new can grow. The sisters never demanded I share my story, yet their lives spoke loudly. Their discipline, their gentleness, their unshaken devotion, these things wrapped around me like a cloak. I had come to them as a wounded girl, but slowly I began to imagine what it would mean to live not only as a survivor, but as a servant of God. It was not an easy thought. At first the idea frightened me. Had I not already given too much of myself away? Had I not been forced into silence for so long? How could I choose silence now, as a vow? The questions circled in my mind, but the more time I spent within those walls, the more I saw that the silence of the sisters was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of purpose. I watched them rise before dawn, voices blending together in morning prayers. Their footsteps moved in harmony through corridors lit by candlelight. Their laughter, quiet but genuine, echoed during meals shared in community. They carried burdens too, yet their burdens did not crush them. They seemed to stand taller, to live freer, because their lives were no longer their own. They were given. For the first time, I wondered if perhaps my own brokenness could be given too. If perhaps the years of anguish could be transformed into a vow that meant something greater than my pain. I remember the night the thought crystallized. I was kneeling in the chapel, the light from a dozen candles flickering against the stained glass, when a hymn rose softly around me. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I felt the presence of God, not as silence, but as comfort. In that stillness I heard a whisper, not with my ears, but with my soul. Your life is not ruined, it is mine. I wept then, quietly, shoulders shaking as the hymn rose higher. I was not weeping only for what I had lost. I was weeping for what I might yet find. From that night, the path felt clearer. I continued my studies, continued to heal in fragments, but deep within me, I began preparing for the possibility that I would one day wear the habit. It was not about running away from my past. It was about reclaiming it. The vow of chastity for me was not an empty promise. It was a declaration that no man could ever again define my body or my soul. The vow of obedience was not submission. It was freedom from the chaos of a home ruled by violence. And the vow of poverty was not deprivation. It was the choice to live without chains of pride or shame. Still, the decision was not immediate. Doubt crept in often. There were days when memories overwhelmed me, when the very thought of trusting any authority, even God's, felt impossible. I wrestled with anger, with fear, with the question of whether my calling was true or merely an escape. The sisters guided me patiently. God does not demand perfection, one told me. He asks only for surrender. It took years of inner struggle before surrender finally felt possible. When the time came to declare my choice, I was no longer the frightened girl who hid in silence. I was a young woman scarred, but not destroyed, ready to give my life to something larger than myself. The day of my acceptance into the novitiate remains one of the clearest memories of my life. I stood at the front of the chapel, hands trembling, heart pounding, as I spoke the words of commitment. The sisters surrounded me, their faces radiant with joy, their voices strong as they welcomed me into their community. I did not wear the habit that day. It would come later, after years of training and discernment. But in my heart, the decision was sealed. The life I had once thought stolen was being offered back to me, not in the shape I expected, but in a form that gave it meaning. When I finally did don the habit, years later, it was with tears streaming down my face. The fabric felt heavy on my shoulders, yet it was the weight of freedom. I was no longer a prisoner of my father's sins. I was a servant of God, bound not by fear, but by faith. And yet even in that moment of joy, I knew the journey was not over. Vows do not erase scars. Faith does not erase memory. Healing is not a single act, but a lifelong work. Still, I had chosen my path. I had chosen not to let my story end in silence. Looking back now, I see how every step, every collapse, every whispered prayer, every night of terror led me to this place. Pain did not define me, but it shaped me into someone who could choose differently. And in choosing differently, I found not only refuge, but calling. Still, there is one truth I must admit. Even after vows, even after years in the convent, the scars remained. They whispered to me in the dark, reminding me that healing is never complete. But I learned to carry them not as chains, but as witness, because the habit was not just cloth. It was testimony. Testimony that a life once shattered could still be given meaning. And yet, even with the habit upon my shoulders, I knew there was more work ahead. The past was not done speaking. The scars still needed to tell their story, not only for my sake, but for the sake of others still living in silence. I speak to you now not as the child I once was, nor as the broken girl who lived through silence, but as the woman I became. Life is not a neat story tied with ribbons of resolution. It is jagged. It carries scars. And even as a nun, clothed in habit and guided by faith, I carry those scars still. They live beneath the surface of my skin, in the corners of my memory, in the shadows of my prayers. But they no longer rule me. For years, I believed that what my father did defined me. I thought I would never be more than his victim, never escape the silence that pressed down upon me like iron chains. But I learned slowly and painfully that survival itself is an act of defiance, that waking each morning, breathing, praying, and choosing to live is resistance against the cruelty meant to destroy me. The convent became more than a refuge. It became a place of transformation. The sisters taught me not only how to pray, but how to live with purpose. They showed me that faith is not about erasing the past. It is about holding the past before God and allowing Him to shape it into something meaningful. My pain did not vanish when I took my vows, but it was no longer senseless. It became a testimony. There are still nights when the old memories visit me. I wake with a pounding heart, the echo of footsteps in my mind, the weight of shadows pressing close. But instead of collapsing into fear, I rise from my bed, light a candle, and kneel. I whisper prayers not of desperation, but of remembrance. I pray for the child I was, for the strength that carried me through, for the women and men who still live in silence as I once did. And I pray for my father, not with anger, but with a trembling mercy that I did not believe I was capable of. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is laying down the burden so it does not consume you. I sometimes wonder what became of him. He grew old, bitter, unrepentant. I do not seek to excuse him, nor do I deny the wreckage he left in his wake, but I refuse to let him be the author of my final chapter. That power belongs only to God and to me. When I share my story now, I do not do it to shock. I do it because there are countless souls still trapped in silence, still believing they are alone. To them I say, you are not alone. Your silence may feel like a cage, but cages can break. And when they do, you will find wings you did not know you had. To those who carry scars like mine, I want you to know something important. Brokenness does not mean you are beyond repair. It does not mean your life is wasted. Scars are not proof of weakness. They are proof that you endured. that you lived through nights that could have killed you, yet you are still here, still breathing, still capable of love, of faith, of joy. The girl I once was did not believe she would ever escape. She thought she would vanish under the weight of fear, but that girl grew into me, the woman who kneels each day in prayer, the woman who tends gardens and sings hymns, the woman who wears the habit not as a disguise but as a declaration. I am still here. My journey is not without pain. Healing is not a destination, but a path I continue to walk each day. Yet I walk it with strength I never imagined I possessed. And that strength is not mine alone. It comes from God, from the community that embraced me, from the resilience born of every night I survived. When I think back to the moment I broke, the night I whispered for any end, I realize that breaking was not the end after all. It was the beginning. It was the moment the silence began to crack, the moment the truth began its slow rise into the light. Breaking was the doorway to becoming, so I carry my scars openly, not with shame, but with honesty. They remind me of where I have been. They remind me that even in darkness light can be found. They remind me that while I was once silenced, I now have a voice, and I choose to use it. If you hear my story and see only sorrow, then you have missed the heart of it. The heart of my story is not despair. It is survival. It is faith. It is the simple, powerful truth that what was meant to destroy me became the very soil in which my calling was planted. And so I end with this. Whatever silence you are carrying, whatever scars you hide beneath your skin, know that you are stronger than the chains that bind you. You may feel broken, but brokenness is not the end. It can be the place where new life begins. I broke. Yes, I did. But I also healed. I chose faith. I chose life. And in choosing, I found freedom.